I think we're going to get started and begin the conversation with some introductions. So I'm Justin Fazzari. I'm the Senior Broadband Strategist here at Sanborn. We do a lot of work supporting states and localities in their broadband work. We're going to find out today that we have a panel of very experienced folks that really understand this asset mapping and the important aspects around it. A little bit about my background. I've worked at NTIA for a number of years and then moved over to Sanborn to really support their broadband work. With that, I'll hand it over to David Lukens.
Hi, David Lukens. I'm Senior Data Scientist here at Sanborn. So I oversee all of the creation of dynamic data pipelines that fuel our web applications like the Broadband Navigator, and head up our analytics team that provide analytics to broadband offices, ISPs, state directors, anyone who needs to know where things are and how that relates to their problems.
Bob Duchin.
I'm Bob Duchin, VP and co-founder of River Oaks Communications Corporation. We are Colorado-based. I'm an attorney. We've been assisting local governments for many years throughout the United States. I'm pleased to be a part of this panel, and I'm looking forward to sharing some information with you, which I hope will be helpful to your local governments.
Dave Zelenak.
Well, good morning, good afternoon. I'm the other David in the presentation today, David Zelenak. Most of my career has been on the local government side. I've been Public Works Director for about 20 years in two Colorado cities, Colorado Springs, where I am now, and in the Denver area city government of Centennial. And then since then, I've been helping about 40 or 50 or so communities with fiber, broadband, telecommunications, concerns, issues, and thoughts. So happy to help anyone on the call today as well. So glad to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, David. As you can see, our panelists were from all over the country, and we've done work in most places around the country. Please use the question and answer box to put any questions in, and we'll address them at the end of the webinar. If you do not see a Q&A button, click the more, and it should the Q&A should be under there and then pop up for you. Resiliency is a big part of the discussion today. I just want to note that I'm in Omaha, Nebraska, where we're having 50 to 60 mile an hour wind gusts, and we're at high fire danger. And Dave Zelenak's gonna touch on that, but we're already testing sort of the resiliency of networks as we're doing this webinar live. So let's get to the topics of what we'll cover. We're going to look at the local asset mapping framework. So we'll define asset mapping, look at the value proposition, and really what you can assess as return on equities from assets that localities have, and then dive into a little bit of detail on the types of assets and the data points that we can collect to really help you understand what you have at your fingertips. Then we'll take a deeper dive into some specific issues such as best way to manage rights of ways, and this is going to be a big issue as more money continues to filter down for broadband build out. And then we'll talk about incorporating resiliency planning when implementing broadband infrastructure, and then we'll look at the sort of summarize it up in the keys to a successful asset mapping, and then we'll take your questions. So just to kick it off, I was sort of starting with a story. If you remember that show American Pickers, Mike and Frank used to go around into people's old barns and find things that most people thought were basically junk and throwaways, and they'd find real value there and be able to purchase those items and then resell them on the market. And so really sort of the analogy for what we're talking about here, these are assets that are in your community, in your locality. Find them, document them, and then see what value they can offer for the new infrastructure that's going to be coming into your community. So I think really want to take a look at what you have there. And so as we move on to looking at the three takeaways, one is the asset mapping. So knowing where assets are located is essential to success, and this requires data analytics and mapping expertise. Looking at rights of way, so understanding federal, state, and local laws. So this really leads to different legal considerations that could be really important for your community. And then resiliency. So with the increasing of frequency of, extreme weather events that we've seen all across the country, it's something to really take into consideration and build into plans and make it actionable. And I think they will talk about that and how you really make it as something that you can really lean on if, unfortunately, one of these extreme weather events occurs in your community. So looking at leveraging broadband infrastructure assets. So really what we take in our approach, our team approach, is very holistic of the assets in your locality to help you plan and make decisions. Identify opportunities and problems and really aggregate information that's all out there, but it's probably scattered and not in one central location. We'll take an infrastructure inventory. So again, you don't know what you have until you've inventoried it. We do take a digital equity analysis view that you should also look at what are the digital equity needs, and really communities across the country. Digital equity can be defined very differently, but there are needs within that bucket that communities can point to say, hey, these are things we'd like to address as we're doing our asset inventory. Looking at asset value, so this gets to what is your return on equity? So what are those assets and how can they be leveraged to bring income or other benefits to your community? And then software considerations. So what do you want to use to help you gather this information? There's a lot of tools out there, and so it's just not a one size fits all on the software considerations. So on this slide, I just want to pause for a second and see if anyone on the panel wants to offer any additional commentary.
Just one comment, Justin, since I can't resist. One of the things you mentioned about is looking at value where you didn't think you had it. One project we did for a city here in Colorado was looking at abandoned underground water pipes and repurposing those water pipes as fiber optic conduits. They are very expensive to replace, as you can imagine, $30, $40 a linear foot when you've already got. This city had a couple thousand feet of abandoned water pipes. It was cracked and not usable for that purpose, but was a fabulous conduit and saved them almost $500,000 from just one water pipe under Main Street. So just one illustration there to your point.
And I think that brings up a really important point that relates back. Justin, you said, this data is out there. You just have to know how to put it together. Sometimes it's really not. Sometimes things like those old water pipes, there might not be no record of them. There might be no mapping of them, but it's all about how we can then utilize, whether that's automating turning PDFs into maps, whether that's automating the way that we use aerial imagery to identify the way different features relate to each other. Creating something that can fill in the gaps when there really isn't an active data source that you can use is a really important part of this process.
Good point, David number one.
No, you're David.
Justin, if I could add one other thing,
Sure,
and
go ahead, Bob.
in dealing with, we've been doing this work across the country for a long time. And what I found is that, particularly in local governments, each department has its own particular set of responsibilities. This is the perfect opportunity for you to go to your colleagues and say, who knows where the antennas are on the water towers? Who's familiar with the rights of way? Who knows what's in the ground? And oftentimes that information is not centrally located within a local government. So one of the challenges here, and I know we've got a lot of planners and a lot of GIS folks on this webinar listening in, I urge you to go to your colleagues, and whether you want to create a committee or do something so that you can create the opportunity for your city, your county to have one centralized database. So you know what you have and where it's located, and if it has capacity available to leverage your assets.
Mm-hmm. Bob, a very excellent point. Here in Colorado Springs, I can tell you that the Colorado Springs utility enterprise people do not talk to the Colorado Springs. They call it the general city in Colorado Springs. And even within the general city, you've got the IT department may not talk to the public works department, and they sure aren't talking or sharing with the utility department. So one piece of advice I would offer the audience is as Bob pointed out, to whatever extent you can clang some heads or even kick this up to a higher level. Get some department heads involved. I would even offer, Justin, and kick me under the table or under the Zoom screen here, a lunch and learn or a deep dive for anyone on the call today to explore that. Go grab a couple of your senior managers, and I would be happy to have a sit down just like this and even do an encore presentation highlighting the points that Bob and David number one just made.
Thanks, David. And that's a great transition point because we'd be happy to have those follow-up discussions and really dig deeper into sort of the level that detail that we're getting into today. So what is asset mapping? It's basically a geospatial exercise, using technology, see where things are located, what's associated with what and where are our assets. We really are collecting, organizing, and tracking, and really coming back to that idea, centralizing the data. There are some real challenges with this, as have been raised before, on whether the data is available, whether you need to create that data, who you need to talk to get that data. So again, just for a minute, I'll open it up and sort of to any experiences on major challenges around this issue.
I think one of the first things you're always going to see is data coming in different formats. Sometimes in different projections in terms of maps, and with completely different sets of attributes. And while you can just fight your way through that in a nasty Excel sheet, I think there are tools available now, open source tools that we can leverage to allow lots of different types of feedback from lots of different stakeholders and create one unified pipeline for all of that data, while making sure that it's standardized. And a great example of this is working with ISP data and where their fiber is. A lot of ISPs have been cobbled together by 15 different acquisitions over the years, and all of their fiber lines are in different projections and they're way off the road. But we can now conflate those data sets with rights of way and other known infrastructure to get everything 99.9% on point, have that reviewed by an outside party that can provide comments and input as we make that new map, and then make sure that everything lines up effectively. So those real problems that come from different sources of data are now something that we have tools and software that we can use to really make that a little bit less painful.
David, to your point, here in Colorado Springs, there is not one fiber, as you pointed out, ISP, Internet Service Provider. There's not 2, 3, 4, there's 8 different ones. It is the Wild West here in Colorado Springs. I'll tell you right now, everyone from Google, which is probably the most recognizable name, down to smaller ones, Metronet, Underline, Comcast, CenturyLink, you name them, they're all digging up the streets, not just here in Colorado Springs. I know Lakewood has a massive program going on now in the Denver area. The point, though, that I'd like to underscore that David was making, though, is that as these people come forward to your government for permits, I would insist that every, as David said, every attribute, every inch of every pipe, X, Y, Z coordinates, and some of the cities here in Colorado even will provide penalties if they tell you through a GIS layer, they bring in forward, oh yeah, we have an orange pipe 18 inches to the left of this fire hydrant and it's not there. They get fined for that. And so not only should you not be using your resources to upload that data, you should be charging them so you get a full, what's called cost recovery. I would shoot for 100% cost recovery of everything. Insist they bring you the files ready to upload in the standard format, as David was saying. So right now we're seeing nationally, I think there's $55 billion of federal money and probably $250 billion of private sector money. But it really is the Wild West. This will go on for another 5 or 10 years. But if you catch them at the front end and require them, as David was saying, get those attributes in one common database, this is the time to do it, and it shouldn't cost you a nickel. So sorry, David, for stealing your thunder, but you set up a great point. Thank you.
Thanks. And now we'll kind of move into so what are some of the aspects we could think of as far as a return on equity? And I'll kind of go through these at a high level, and then we'll open it up to the team here. Leverage access for income from new broadband infrastructure. You're going through the BEAD program and other programs. You're going to have ISPs building infrastructure in the not too distant future. What assets do you have in your community, your locality that you may be able to leverage in order to generate some income. As these ISPs come into your communities, you might want to make sure you coordinate the infrastructure builds and make sure, things like dig once policies, that can really minimize the cost of road repair and installing conduit, those types of things. Coordination is really important. We've kind of hit the theme of centralizing the infrastructure data. I think that's again, a huge point. We'll talk a little bit more about streamlined permitting. That can hold up a project, and make major delays in programs, and installs. So want to streamline that as much as possible. And then as sort of the panel made the point, having different departments talk to each other, having agency heads talk to each other, and getting groups together that can actually increase government efficiency, I think is a very important point. A couple other examples of cost savings that are associated with doing this type of effort. Less hours and risk on field operations, known maintenance schedules and replacement schedules, awareness of economic opportunities. I think the one thing that doesn't get talked about enough is, how can broadband infrastructure increase the economic opportunities in a locality? And you can really tie that to digital equity too, opportunities in digital equity to improve and decrease the digital divide. Transparency. This effort makes it very transparent and can make you transparent internally and externally, depending on what your needs are. And then we get to the last few, but the management efficiencies, compliance, and then just better decision making, using data to make more informed decisions, I think is really something that you can leverage. So if we kind of take a deeper dive on the next slide, and I'll kind of open this up to the panel, if we could just go one more. And then so if we want to just advance one more slide. Okay, great. If we want to sort of look at existing broadband networks, so what are the opportunities there? Existing conduit and open access, understanding what that is, rights of ways we pointed to before, what existing utility infrastructure is there, leveraging your anchor institutions. That's sometimes something that folks don't think about too often, but it is an asset also that can really be leveraged. High elevation infrastructure always could be key for things like fixed wireless, and then just your general planning of how you're going about it. So I'll sort of open it up to the panel here to see if there's some comments on any of these specifically.
Sure. I'd like to start by trying to dispel the rumor that lawyers are always an impediment to getting things done. I'm going to give you a quick example. A city was stuck because they really didn't know what to do because somebody wanted to lease. The provider wanted to put fiber inside of city conduit, and the city didn't have the expertise in house. So what they did is, and we got involved, and we have now helped the city lease out some of their conduit to an ISP. The city's going to receive monthly income, and they can also receive, instead of all the monthly income, in-kind internet services at a couple city locations. That's the sort of creativity that can be brought to this process where you've got these assets in place. You've got a need because you've got providers who want to disseminate the broadband. They're highly competitive with one another. And so you just have to think about this in a way that is not conventional. And in working with the provider community, these sorts of arrangements can be successfully put together.
Bob, I don't know that we've ever spoken, but again, here in Colorado, the state DOT just imposed, to your exact point, an annual charge for doing just what you said, which is putting fiber into not just the state conduit, that's a kind of a different rate schedule, but simply burying fiber in the state right away, 3 cents a linear foot per year. That doesn't sound like a lot of money, but when you're going 22 miles, run that times 5280 times 3 cents a foot times every number of years. It's a 20-year minimum lease. Those numbers can add up pretty well. Beyond that, I can also tell you that a good going rate for installing underground conduit, if you do it by boring, $20 to $30 per foot to install it once and be gone. But about 10% of that is a good annual lease rate. So could be anywhere from 50 cents, a dollar, $2 per foot per year for existing plastic pipe that you already have in the ground. Again, you have to track it, pay for it, account for it, but it can be a great revenue source.
Yeah, and I'll follow up. If, I'm sitting here listening to the webinar and I'm thinking, there's a concept here, but then you're also providing examples. And so, how easily can this be done in my locality? But I think you can expand on this a little bit, but you've done many of these across the country of help of these types of examples that you provided. I mean, it is very doable. As you said, Bob, it just takes a little bit of sort of stepping forward on it and a little bit of creativity.
If I could add to that, Justin, one of the things you touched on is a dig once policy. If a provider is going to drop in its own conduit, have them drop in a shadow conduit for the city. We've been trying to encourage cities to do that for years. You may think, well, why do we need some extra conduit? Well, you know why? Because maybe you want to hook up your traffic lights. That's being done in a city in New Mexico. Or maybe you say, well, maybe I want to use this for some other purposes. As you're doing this, think about streamlining your permitting process. We're not here to be the hurdle that has to be jumped over by the providers. You need to look at this in a way that your citizens want broadband, your businesses want broadband. How can you make this process how can you do this in such a way where it's beneficial for the providers? They don't get hung up for a year trying to pull a permit, and yet it's beneficial for you so that you can protect your rights away. And there are ways to accomplish that.
Yeah. Bob, we did exactly that in the Denver metro area in Centennial. Every inch of every fiber optic conduit was put in by a private sector installer. Came to the city, just like you said. There was a requirement for a permit, obviously, and a co-location plan that the city manager authorized that basically said, look, we'll cover 100% of the upcharge. So you're digging a trench, you're putting in a board conduit that's $20, like I said, per foot. We'll pay you 100% of the delta, 100% of the upcharge. That turned out to be about $1 per foot for the city-owned or soon-to-be city-owned plastic pipe, $1 a foot, and then $1 a foot to the contractor to put it in. So they're putting in pipe that's costing them $20 to $30, and the city would have about $2 upcharge. We put in 62 miles throughout the city of Centennial. That's in the Denver Tech Center, south, very high commercial, high value area. We put 62 miles in. The city put in $300,000, $1 a foot at a time, $300,000. The value of that 62-mile system now is valued at about 20 million. So we put in 300K and we got 20 million back. So to your point, yeah, that's a real life example. Happy to explain that and walk the folks through that as to how we did it and how and why it's so successful. But, yeah.
And I'd add on to that, the definition of adequate broadband that we have now today is probably not going to be the definition in 3, 5, certainly 10 years from now. And so putting in that extra capacity, I think is really crucial. So really thinking forward. And then I think, what the panel is getting at too is, there's the sort of what the ISP wants to do, which is put in that infrastructure, right? And hook up more customers. But you as a locality want to look at, well, what's the benefit to the residents and how can we not cost the taxpayers, subsidying the ISP? And so where is that line? I think some of your examples are really hitting on that. I just want to open it to David Lukens in case you want to touch on anything.
Yeah, I think that last point you made, Justin, is spot on because those are both excellent ideas, but not every idea you hear about for how to maximize your assets is going to be good. A few of the cities that I've worked with when I worked for the state of Connecticut, they were just dying to put in fixed wireless networks. They just wanted, they wanted to, we're going to use these towers and we're going to use these skyscrapers that are already in our cities, but they did no analysis of what obstructions were in the way of their residents and the places where they were putting their equipment. So there were just giant holes in the service area for this fixed wireless infrastructure. And so I think they're examples of great ways to utilize your assets. And there are some things that you really need to be careful for in making sure that you don't fall into the trap of just, hey, we've got assets, we got to use them. And so I think that balance is really important to find. And I think that's That's what we want to help people to buy.
Mhm. It's the old adage of a dog chasing a truck. He doesn't think ahead. If he catches it, what's he do with it? So yeah, they're chasing this fixed wireless. Ooh, so you get it. What do you do with it?
All right, let's move ahead to the sort of a deeper dive into this on the data collection side piece. And I'm just gonna sort of hand this over to you, David Lukens, to talk through a couple of these.
David, if I could go first. You first of all, you got to look and see what sort of provider you're going to be dealing with. Is it a cable company? Is it an ISP? Is it a telecom company? And that's going to drive your regs. For example, if you're going to be doing 5G regs with companies such as Verizon or AT&T and some of the others, the FCC came out with a set of orders starting back in 2018. We're not going to go through those chapter and verse mercifully during this webinar, but here's what you need to know. You need to be aware of what the federal laws are and what your state laws are. How much can you charge the provider? What sort of requirements can you put on them? And what's going to happen if they decide at some point that they don't need their outdated equipment anymore? Are they going to seamlessly remove that from the right of way? So with that in mind, you need to think ahead. You've got 4G and 5G now and wireless regulations, but think about where you want this to go as you move down the road. David?
So I'm not sure why we went back and forth from a slide. So, but I would say that for all of these tasks, I think you have to start with a very basic data collection exercise, and that should be, all right, what do we already have digitized? And then what do we need to get from a manual format or through feature extraction to be able to start to answer the questions that Bob's bringing up, right? So before we can even talk about where we might be putting things and where we want to use those laws to then leverage our assets, we want to go through that basic exercise of making sure we have all physical addresses accurately geocoded, understand how those relate to different asset owners through parcel data and other local land records, and start to build up that basic database that then can be our tool for leveraging our assets.
Well, thanks, David. I'm going to hand this next portion off to Bob to talk about rights of way a little bit more in depth.
Sure. And if we could go to the next slide, please, that would be great. So you've got a host of providers out there. You've got finite capacity in your right of way. So here's the reality. You've got the cable companies with whom we've dealt with for years, Comcast, Charter, which is now known as Spectrum. You've got telecom providers like Zayo and Ziply and CenturyLink, now called Lumen. You've got ISPs who are going to want to put fiber in your right of way. You've got the 5G providers I mentioned. With each of those providers comes a different sort of regulatory agreement. You may want to do a cable franchise, or you may live in a state where there's statewide cable franchising, and the provider has to get what's called a statewide certificate of franchise authority. With the telecom providers, you want to look at doing some sort of a right-of-way agreement. How much can you charge them compensation-wise? That's not the same as a cable provider. With the ISPs, internet used to be what was called an information service, and that's gone back and forth at the FCC. It's now a telecom service. It's a Title II service. So you want to say to yourself, okay, can I franchise the internet service providers? Some are going to say yes, and some are going to say no, because we've run into that elsewhere. The point is, you have to be nimble. You need to be working with your city attorney's office or with your county prosecutor's office to develop these certain types of agreements, and they have to be fact specific to which asset you intend to make available to the providers. For example, if somebody wants to go up on one of your water towers, if that's not a small cell master license agreement, that should be a tower lease. And my advice to all of you is look carefully at the template lease. That's the starting point. You may say, oh, this looks great. We're going to get 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 a month from a provider to go up on our water tower or our water tanks or our own towers. But here's something you got to think about. What if the provider needs to move its equipment up on that water tank to someplace else on the water tank? Who's going to pay for that? You want to make sure that's not going to be the local government. That could cost you tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to have somebody move their equipment. If you don't have a protection for yourself in that lease agreement, and that's where I'm going. Don't just dump at the monthly rental. Think about what the big picture looks like. What about a CPI increase? What about if we want somebody to move so that another provider can get up there? What about a revenue share? If they go on your tower and they sublease to someone else, all these things need to be taken into consideration. And I say this because we get involved in some of the messy situations and some of the situations on the front end. With the point being, it's a lot better to deal with this proactively than reactively.
Mhm. You know, Bob, you raise a good point. One lesson that one city I've worked with has learned the hard way is kind of by trial and error. The city manager imposed at first a directive. Oh yeah, everybody needs to co-locate, and most cable installers went along with that with the city manager directive. But a few of them pushed back. So they went to a city manager or to a city council resolution. That's one step higher legally, as you know. And all of them but one agreed to that. And so the city ended up going from city manager directive to resolution to a city council approved ordinance requiring all of them. And of course, higher than that is a franchise agreement. So, Bob, to your point, absolutely, these things aren't always easy to do. There may be some trial and error, but you need some qualified help so you don't have to go through. It's kind of like pin the tail on the donkey. Is it an ordinance? Is it a resolution? Is it a directive? Is it a franchise change? That takes some experience, people like Bob. So, and I wish I'd found you, Bob, 10 years ago on that one.
Well, Dave, I appreciate that. Let's talk about all this money that's floating around in terms of from the federal government to the state governments to the localities. You've got capital projects funds and you've got BEAD grants. Okay. If you are going to get money from your state, whether it's a CPF grant or it's a broadband, a BEAD grant, you're going to have to negotiate a contract with the state. And I would urge you to carefully take a look at what they're giving you to sign. There are going to be all sorts of rules and regs that are quoted in those sorts of contracts. We're not going to get down in the minutia, but the point is, you really have to know what your local body, what your local government is agreeing to. And we're going to touch on this in just a couple minutes because there's a thing called a clawback out there. And you don't want to be the subject of a clawback of funds from the federal or state government. I mentioned earlier on, for example, with rights of way, that is an incredibly valuable asset. A couple of years ago, I called up a city attorney's office in a location not to be named, and I suggested, how about thinking about monetizing your assets, your right of way? You won't believe how much pushback I got on that. It was like, what are you talking about? We're a local government. We're a public entity. Well, you know what? You have funding needs and you have revenue needs, and these are your assets. And I would urge you to think about what you can do to monetize some of these assets. It may work in some cases, it may not work with other cases. But the point is, at least please consider it. And as you're doing this, talk to your other colleagues at other cities, see what they're doing. This was kind of a out of the box thinking 5-10 years ago. It's not out of the box now. These are your assets. You've got a right to do with them what you want. And you can do this for the betterment of your communities. The other thing I'll mention very quickly is there's a thing called open access networks out there, particularly in California. An entity is going to come in, build a network, and let other providers ride on the network. Okay. And a lot of the private sector doesn't like that because they want to control the asset. They want to own the fiber. They want to own the conduit. The point is, this may be an avenue for companies, particularly ISPs, that are not as large as some of the incumbents, to have a chance to ride on somebody else's network and provide competitive internet services throughout your community. The constituents are going to benefit from that, the businesses and the residents. Next slide, please. Okay. I mentioned the importance of reviewing whatever you're going to contractually agree to with the state or the feds, the clawback. Here it is. The feds give money to a state, the state gives money to a city, the city employs a provider to build out a network. The provider doesn't do what it's supposed to do under the contract. Under that scenario, there are provisions in some of these federal grants and state grants that allow the federal government and the state government to claw back, to say to the city and county, you got to get back the money. Well, you've already spent the money. You've already given it to a provider. They didn't do what they were supposed to do. What you don't want to wind up in is litigation. Our goal is to keep clients out of that scenario. Do this contractually, figure out how you protect yourself, and do it in such a way that you make the provider who's going to build out the network accountable. So you don't have this domino of horrors that can take place, a nightmare situation where, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? We spent $5 million. We don't have that to give back to the state. You don't want that scenario. So please proactively look at what you need to do. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn this over to Dave now, and he's going to talk about a situation that's very real. You look at Maui, you look at California, you look at climate change, and telecommunications networks need to be resilient. Dave?
Bob, I couldn't agree with you more. It's one thing I feel very passionately about ever since the house my son was living in outside of Boulder, Colorado, burnt to the ground a few years ago. So from a very personal perspective, I'm very passionate about this. As Bob said, in California, picture on the right of your screen there was right off CNN. That's the terrible fire in Paradise, California. I believe about 70 people died in that one, largely the result of there's a term there called, and it's even on the top of the slide, that's known in the fire protection business or the firefighting business as a Roman candle. It's a wooden utility pole. It's soaked in a highly flammable preservative called creosote, and those things will go up. Any kindergarten kid with a matchbook can light one up pretty easily. And as you can imagine, if your telecommunications are only what's called single string, that is a lack of redundancy or lack of resiliency, you're putting lives, in this case, 74 people perished in the Paradise Fire. On the left there is a little more recent one, though. That was just on ABC News. It was a cell tower. Not quite a Roman candle, which is what you see on the right there. This was thought to be a resilient cell tower outside of Sacramento just a few months ago. They had a fuel tank because they have I think in California, there's a 48-hour requirement to have backup fuel at the base of fuel tank. So guess what? Forest fire comes along, and there's a great video. You can just go to UC San Diego and see the 2-minute video time lapse with the forest fire approaching. It ignites the fuel tank. The fuel tank ignites and explodes the cell tower. Again, these things are not as resilient, not as robust. Next slide, please, as you'd like to think they are. Speaking of that, so this is even more recent. This is Hurricane Helene. You may recall the North Carolina terrible hurricane from just a few weeks ago. And this is one slide. If you look down toward the bottom there, you'll see North Carolina, and it says total number of cell towers they had in the area is 1452. To the right of that number is cell towers that went out was almost 1,100. So they had 74% of the cell towers in Western North Carolina, 74% were down, taken out. Interestingly, not because of the Roman candle scenario that you just saw directly with the cell tower catching fire or exploding, but the backhaul. The backhaul was not resilient. And so you may have fiber going across a bridge, the bridge gets washed out. You may have 18 miles away, a single string utility pole gets blown over, and that takes out the whole network. That's the kind of resiliency. Those are the problems that we're seeing. And then the last point of this chart here is that on a day-by-day basis, they're bringing back about 10% of them, but still it can take weeks of being without telecommunication service. Next slide, please. This is another one. Here we go. 74% of the cell sites were out, and about 10% came back daily. So next slide, please. Oh, and there's the numbers. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yeah, over 1,000. This is a picture, again, right off the ABC Evening News. Many of you may recall last August, the terrible, terrible fire in Hawaii. This is in the little town of Lahaina on the island of Maui, Hawaii. And tragically, as the number there says, about 104 people perished in this one. The number one reason is well, yes, the root cause was electrical wires hit the ground. About 8 minutes later, high winds blew the fire, and the first house ignited after about 8 minutes after that wire hit the ground. That was the root cause. The actual cause of the fatalities, though, is, oh my God, our city's burning to the ground. Where's grandma? She can't get out of her third floor apartment. My cell phone doesn't work. Well, as it turns out, they had, I think it was 700 utility poles in the Lahaina area, of which 400, so a little over 50% in the Lahaina area, burnt to the ground. And the first one ignited in about 10 minutes. I'm not quite sure what all happened, but telecommunications failures resulted clearly in contributing certainly to the tragic loss of 104 lives. Transportation capacity, in other words, which way out? No, I can't get through here. Which way do I go? Wayfinding errors was also top of the list that they found. One that I'll point out though, that which is counterintuitive, it's one I didn't see coming, is yes, you all know that you run out of water, water pressure is not there. Well, the reason that you run out of water pressure in a mega fire, as these are called now, is that when one house catches fire, you think about this, your plastic pipes, one pipe may burn off, and you get a little spout, looks like a little water fountain, a quarter-inch fountain squirting up. When you have 100 houses, each house has 10 pipes that are all burned off. Now you've got 1,000 or you've got 10,000 water pipes. I know from experience here in the Denver area, the fire in Superior and Louisville, here they call it the Marshall Fire, drained 2 million gallons of water in less than an hour. Not because they're using it for firefighting purposes, but because the houses catch fire, the pipes burn off, and they have no way of controlling the water. It just gravity flows right out of 1,000 or 10,000 open wounds, if you will. Lack of staffing, and again, the point though is that a clear lack of resiliency in telecommunications. Next slide, please. Transportation, wayfinding errors. And again, the number one thing you want to do in a fire is strategically shut off the water to preserve what you have. And you have to have a little bit of remote sensing and some dashboards and some software to do that. So what can you do? Obviously, as David pointed out, and Justin was great to point out, map your assets, know what you have, not just the public sector assets, but the private sector assets. I'll talk just real briefly here about streetlights as being one of those. We call it the humble streetlight. From my perspective, as a telecommunications node, this is a picture I took in Vail, Colorado. It's a humble streetlight. The city of Vail went through a P3, public-private partnership process, and worked out a deal to bring fiber into 34 streetlights, lighting up cell towers off their streetlights. And by the way, there are provisions, and these things can become cash cows. And so what we're seeing across the U.S. right now are hundreds of thousands, probably approaching millions now, of streetlights are being municipalized. In other words, the power company is, for a fee, handing them over to the cities. A good rule of thumb: every streetlight costs a city about $20 per streetlight per month is probably the national average. So think of a streetlight as a $20 a month dispenser of currency, but they're only giving you about $2 a month in power. So again, the city's paying $20 a month to the power company, and the power company is giving not $20 of service back. They take $20 in, they give $2 of power back. And so that huge lopsided, that 10-to-1 ratio is why we're seeing here in Colorado, there are hundreds of thousands of streetlights being municipalized. And then once you own the streetlight, you can either flip the streetlight or you can just lease it outright as a cell tower. There are some rules and regulations. Again, you can't get carried away with this stuff, but there are millions of dollars of new revenues just because you buy the streetlights. Oh, by the way, the conduit, which protects the underground electrical conductor, is also a great fiber optic conduit as well. And so you got two sources of revenue. You make money cash off of renting the streetlight as a cell tower location, and you can make money off of leasing out if there is unused space in the underground conductor conduit. So these things are really cash cows, highly valuable these days. But yeah, redundant telecommunications, you can read there. Resilient utilities, think preventable, and then create a plan to approach all these things. Oh, by the way, I've talked to two different FEMA officials, and they tell me that they will help cities pay the upcharge for making them more resilient. So next slide, please. Talking more about resiliency of infrastructure assets. I think what is really, again, counterintuitive is you think that, wow, the city has or the county has, we've got this great resilient telecommunications network. We have all these towers around, and something big happens. Not what can possibly go wrong with that? Well, I can tell you right now, in the case of Lahaina, in the case of the Marshall Fire, the Paradise Fire, those Roman candles will take out that. Oh, it's really not resilient in call. In fact, I like to talk about what I've coined the term utility fragility. That the reality is that the utility network is really much more fragile than you ever thought it was. When you look at, wow, I never thought that 18 miles away that one critical pole blew over and took out the whole network. Transportation, again, do you have evacuation plans? Contraflow is a hot topic these days. I've heard a counter movement against contraflow. That's where you run traffic backwards, everybody leaving the area. It may or may not be as easy to sign up for. But the bottom line here really is that when it comes down to these emergency situations, you need software, you need dashboards, and you need to be able to have command and control of your infrastructure. And it's got to be interagency. Next slide, please. And I won't read the slides here. I know we're running just a little bit tight for time. We have about 5 minutes to wrap up here. But what I want to point out here is the picture on the right. That's courtesy of Comcast, by the way. That is an underground Comcast brand amplifier that was burnt up pretty badly, as you can see in the Marshall. That's the suburban Denver fire 2 years ago. The reason that amplifier burned up is because Comcast or whoever owned the lid for that vault chose not to upgrade to a fireproof vault. It's just a plastic fiberglass vault. It burned up pretty fast, took out the telecommunications network. So I'm not just picking on aerial telecom, but also if you're not careful, thoughtful about protecting, making more resilient your underground stuff as well. That's a great case in point. So the point is, you can probably try to make them fire resistant, but probably not fireproof. And my next slide, please. Here we go. This is a picture I took. We've been doing some work for the city of Austin, Texas, and I think I may have insulted them a little bit when I showed them, hey, here's one of your critical telecommunications towers. Yeah, this is a private sector tower, and the city also has some stuff. But if you look in the foreground, yeah, there's the electrical power, and they've got a 48-hour backup tank of liquid fuel for the generator. That's great. But look at all that aerial fiber. Again, any kid with a matchbook can go up to a creosoted soaked pole, take one pole out, and you've taken out probably, in this case, you figure 300 cellular users per panel. There's probably a couple thousand people that will lose communication services because one pole went out, feeding the very critical telecommunications network. So anyway, the point is here is that some counterintuitive things. Look at remote control shut off valve, shut off the water when you have a fire. Can you shut off the power? That's what happened in Maui. They didn't shut off the power during high winds. There's a new term called PSPS, public safety power shutoffs, and utilities are spending a lot of money. You need to know where that stuff is to shut it off. Look at undergrounding your telecom. Look at transportation capacity, and really look to think about control systems. You'll hear our Sanborn folks talk about dashboards and software. And of course, the bottom line is interagency. The stuff has to work. It's got to be redundant. It's got to be resilient, and there has to be some diversity in all you do. So with that, I think I'll turn it back to you, Justin.
Well, thanks, David, and thanks, Bob, before David. So really wrapping up here, just want to encourage folks to drop any questions you have into either the chat or the Q&A box. And in wrapping up, really wanted to push the narrative that we're really looking at this as a holistic approach, really understanding stakeholder needs, interests, and requirements. And there's unique circumstances in every situation. So we understand that. We gave a number of examples of different localities and sort of some of the things that they're going through. Have the experience in asset data collection, mapping, and analysis, and really pull that data together so that it's centrally located and you can really utilize the existing data that you have, going back to the point that was made earlier. And then there might be data that is missing, and you have to figure out how to collect it or how to go about obtaining it. Bob talked a lot about the legal considerations, very important. And again, the thread through all this is what value you already have in your community that you can leverage for income and to better support your community. All the speed money and CPF, as was mentioned, that's coming into your community or is going to, that's an opportunity to really leverage the assets that you have. Moving on to the resiliency aspect, it's very important, as we've seen from numerous examples. And I'm sure David could have gone on, for another half an hour about, different things that have happened, natural disasters that, really the community could have benefited with advanced planning and really looking at resiliency as something that really needs to be done in a community. And then finally, evaluating software solutions. So there's a lot of solutions, and we'd be happy to take a deeper dive on all these issues with any folks on the call here, and really evaluate what work best for you. And so Sanborn uses all the common platforms. We also develop our own software, and so we can definitely talk through different solutions. And so with that, I'm not sure that I see any questions in.
Justin, could I throw one back to you and David,
Sure.
please? So as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, okay, we've got the attendees, some are planners, some are GIS people. Some of this may seem daunting because there's so many different things that are involved in this process. Could you or David just give them a quick snapshot as to how you would approach a project if you were going to come in for one of these cities or counties, so they can to help bring some efficiencies to the process?
Sure, I'll take it at a high level, and then David, I'll hand it off to you. But I think some of that follows what the discussion was today, which is we want to understand the needs of the community, but look at what data is available, what's easily available, what can we centralize, and that's sort of our starting point. And then what do we need to go out into the field and collect additional data? Or are there heads of utilities we need to talk to, reach out to the stakeholders in the community, public and private sector? And sort of then that helps us build that data set with even more information. And so once we kind of have put that together, meeting with the community, the locality on, okay, so we have this data, we can now make more informed decisions. What would what's the direction you'd like to go in on your strategic planning? Some of that involves stakeholder engagement as an aspect, making sure you get the input of all the stakeholders in the community, and then really rolling that up into an actionable plan that can be implemented. And I think that's a theme that we were pushing throughout this discussion, is there's real world examples here of the work that everyone on the panel has been doing. And so strategic assessments, strategic reports can get, I think, a bad name. What we're saying is it's something that's actionable. You can take it and really improve your community from all this analysis and use it and make it valuable, and then keep it updated as you move forward, because the initial push to put this all together is a big lift, as it's an incremental lift then as moving forward if you keep it updated. Because I think as David Zelenot said, the broadband efforts and related efforts around it are going to be going on for many years moving forward. So even though this BEAD that they say sort of a once in time investment from the federal government, that there will continue to be broadband programs from the federal government, from the state government, that address different aspects that aren't covered in the current programs. It's just going to be sort of the world we're living in moving forward. So I'll hand it off to David Lukens. So David, if you wanted to provide any more detail or a different take.
No, I think that was all great. I think from the technical side, there's not a one size fits all solution. And what we specialize in is finding the point of entry that works best for a specific project. And so, from everything from building data pipelines, does that mean we need to, look at imagery, do feature extraction, and try and pull those into a data pipeline that matches it with your old PDFs that are somewhere, or old documents that are somewhere in a file cabinet? If we need to, that's what we have to do. But then if you have a more modernized system, how can we tap into those data flows, make them easily accessible to everyone that needs them, and try and just improve the efficiency of how we do comparisons and actually put together our asset maps?
Thanks, David. We have a question here from Jerry Hammond. He said, any tips on cities with good UG conduit lease contracts to private companies?
What I would say, Justin, is let's make you the point of contact.
Mhm.
And if the person who asked the question could route that through you, you can route it through me, and I'll be glad to provide some information.
If we want to just go to the next slide, my email address is on there. Great. So here's my email address. Any follow-up questions or, let's meet one-on-one to really talk about what your specific asset management needs are. We'd be more than happy to do that. And thanks, Jared, for leaving your email. I'll open it up one more time to any more questions. And if we don't get any, want to give our panel a chance to make any final comments. I don't see anything coming through. So, David Lukens, do you want to kick us off as just a final thought for today?
I would just say that, a lot of these things can be pretty daunting when you start looking at at least on the data side, the technical side, how are we going to pull all this together? And it can be, and it can be very challenging, but I think the number of solutions that are now available through open source technologies so that you don't have to spend a bunch of money on a paid platform, and we can help you leverage those, really makes that a much easier task than it was even 2 or 3 years ago. So I think just keeping those things in mind and making sure that you know that there is someone who can help you use those is what we really want to pass along.
Thanks, David. Bob?
What I would say is there are a lot of providers out there and there are a lot of scenarios, and each one is going to have its own permutations. I would encourage you to work closely with your city attorney's office, your county prosecutor's office. If they're not familiar with what types of agreements are needed, what sort of P3s can be put together, public-private partnerships, or what sort of arrangements can be structured, I'd encourage you to reach out to outside consultants as a resource, because you want to get this right on the front end. It's a lot better, and you're going to get a lot more tangible results that are going to be beneficial to your community if you do what needs to be done proactively. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. And Dave Zola?
Yeah, just a closing comment. Again, what I said earlier, which is we'd be thrilled to work with any of you in the future. Work through Justin, and if you have specific questions, comments, thoughts, even you'd like a lunch and learn, a special one-on-one, a sit-down, a discussion, whatever we can do to help. We've been through it. Trust us. We probably have 100+ cities and counties in what, Bob? I think 40 different states. So if you're thinking about getting into this, questions, it's kind of like Jimmy John's, when you walk in, smells are free, questions are free. I'm happy to help you out to get you on your way, and you need only ask. So Justin is a great point of contact, and you got his email right there on the screen. How's that?